The morning air on March 15th always held a particular chill for me, a crispness that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with memory. It was the anniversary of my investiture, the day I had first donned the black robes and taken my place on the federal bench. 15 years. I stood in my sun-drenched kitchen, a simple two-story colonial in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, and looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. It was me, younger, my face a mixture of terror and fierce determination, standing beside my husband, Marcus, and my two children, Maya and Jordan. My hand was on a Bible, my other hand raised, taking the oath that had become the central pillar of my existence. "You look like you're about to either save the world or throw up," Marcus had teased later that night, and he wasn't wrong. The weight of the robe, the gravity of the responsibility. It felt like a physical pressure, a promise I had to spend the rest of my life trying to keep. Now, 15 years later, the robe felt like a second skin, but the weight of the promise had only grown heavier. I took a sip of my coffee, black, no sugar, and looked out the window at my garden. The first crocuses were pushing their way through the soil, stubborn and vibrant against the lingering winter brown. A metaphor, perhaps. Hope pushing through hardship. It was a theme I saw every day, both in my garden and in my courtroom. My phone buzzed on the granite countertop. A text from Jamal, a 17-year-old boy from my old neighborhood whom I'd been mentoring for the past year. He was brilliant, a poet with the heart of a lion, but he was trapped in the gravity of his circumstances, constantly pulled down by the lack of opportunity and the overabundance of suspicion that defined life for a young black man in the city. Jamal. Got the scholarship application in, Judge K. Fingers crossed. I smiled. I'd spent hours with him on that essay, coaxing out the powerful, intelligent voice he so often kept hidden behind a veneer of teenage nonchalance. Me. They would be fools not to see your light. Proud of you. Call me tonight. This was the other side of the law, the one you didn't see in the courtroom. The quiet, persistent work of trying to build ladders so that fewer people would fall into the pits I presided over every day. I finished my coffee and grabbed my briefcase. Today's docket was heavy. A complex patent dispute, a sentencing for a multi-million-dollar fraud case, and most pressingly, a pre-trial hearing for a civil rights lawsuit filed against the city's police department, Johnson v. City of Brookhaven, a case alleging a pattern of racial profiling and excessive force, a case that had already drawn national media attention and was making a lot of powerful people very nervous, a case that felt, in many ways, like the culmination of my 15 years on the bench. I left my house in my civilian clothes, simple slacks, a silk blouse, a tailored blazer. The uniform of a professional woman, not a federal judge. It was a habit I'd formed early on. I liked to walk the last few blocks to the courthouse, to feel the city's rhythm, to enter the building not as an elevated symbol of the law, but as one of the people it was meant to serve. It kept me grounded. Today, however, that simple habit would lead to a collision that would test every principle I held dear and push the scales of justice to their breaking point. Officer Frank Martinez started his day with the bitter taste of stale coffee and resentment. He sat in the cramped briefing room of the 12th Precinct, the air thick with the smell of cheap disinfectant and cynicism, and stared at the new promotion list posted on the bulletin board. His name, once again, was not on it. Sergeant. He should have been a sergeant 5 years ago. He had more arrests, had taken more guns off the street, had kicked in more doors than any of the ass-kissing college boy names on that list. "See that, Frank?" His partner, Officer Rodriguez, mumbled around a mouthful of donut. Thompson made sergeant. Guy wouldn't know real police work if it bit him on his Ivy League ass. Martinez grunted, crushing his empty styrofoam cup in his fist. Thompson. A kid who spent more time on his diversity and inclusion paperwork than he did on the street. That's what the job was now. Paperwork and politics. Appeasing the community leaders, kowtowing to the activist judges who let the scum he arrested right back out onto the street. "It's a joke," Martinez spat. "We do the dirty work. We face the animals, and they give the promotions to the guys who can write a pretty report about their feelings." Speaking of animals, Officer Thompson, the other Thompson, Rick, a portly cop with a mean streak, chimed in from the next table. "Dispatch is already lighting up about the usual ghetto rats trying to scam their way into the courthouse for their welfare hearings." A round of cynical laughter filled the room. It was a familiar refrain, the gallows humor that passed for camaraderie in a world that Martinez saw in stark, simple terms: cops and criminals, us and them. He saw himself as a warrior, a thin line of blue holding back the tide of chaos. The 17 complaints filed against him over his 12-year career weren't signs of a problem. They were badges of honor. They meant he was doing his job. They meant he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, to be the kind of cop the city really needed, even if it didn't want to admit it. "All right, let's hit it," Martinez said, grabbing his duty belt. He and Rodriguez had drawn perimeter duty at the federal courthouse today. A babysitting gig, mostly. Keeping the undesirables from bothering the important people inside. He particularly loathed the federal courthouse. It was a different world, full of lawyers in $1,000 suits and judges who looked down on street cops like him from their ivory towers, passing judgment on situations they couldn't possibly understand. He felt their contempt every time he had to testify, the way they picked apart his reports, questioned his instincts. Today he was in no mood for any of it. As he walked out into the cold March morning, he felt a familiar simmering anger coiling in his gut. Someone, somewhere, was going to push his buttons today. He could just feel it. And when they did, he would be more than ready to push back. The bronze letters above the grand entrance of the United States Courthouse were polished to a brilliant shine, a monument to the ideals of justice and equality. I always took a moment to look at them before I went inside, a small ritual to center myself, to remember the promise etched in that stone. But this morning, I never made it to the doors. I was about 20 feet away, walking up the broad stone steps, when a figure blocked my path. A police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of sour disapproval. "That's far enough," he said, his voice a low growl. I stopped, confused. "Excuse me, officer?" His eyes raked over me, from my sensible low heels to the simple leather briefcase in my hand. It was a look I knew well. A look of instant dismissal, of categorization. In his eyes, I was not a professional on her way to work. I was a problem. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in," he sneered, not to me, but to a second officer who was approaching. The words were so unexpected, so laden with casual venom, that for a moment, I was speechless. I felt a hot flush of anger rise in my chest, but years of judicial temperament kept it in check. "Officer," I began, my voice firm but even. "I work in this building. If you'll just let me pass—" "I don't think so," he cut me off. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, his sheer size an act of intimidation. "What's in the bag?" "My case files for the day," I said, holding my briefcase tighter. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Case files? Right. You're probably here to protest some scumbag, or maybe you're one of their baby mamas looking for a handout." This was escalating at a speed that was both shocking and chillingly familiar. This was the exact pattern I'd read in countless affidavits, the textbook prelude to a violation of civil rights. "I am a federal judge," I said, the words clear and precise. "My name is Kesha Williams, and my courtroom is on the 4th floor. Now I would appreciate it if you would step aside." I had expected the statement to stop him cold. Instead, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. His face contorted with rage. "A judge? A filthy animal like you? That's the funniest damn thing I've heard all day." And then he moved. It happened so fast. His open palm cracked against my face with a force that snapped my head to the side. The sound of the slap echoed on the stone steps. My expensive briefcase flew from my grip, the latch springing open. Legal documents, briefs, motions, judicial memoranda, the very fabric of my professional life, scattered like confetti across the courthouse steps, caught by the cold morning wind. Before I could even register the stinging pain in my cheek, he grabbed me by the throat, the fabric of my silk blouse twisting tight. He slammed me backward against the cold, unyielding stone of the courthouse wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me, my head hitting the wall with a sickening thud. His face was inches from mine, his breath sour with coffee and hate. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses," he spat, his voice a venomous whisper. He twisted my arms behind my back with brutal efficiency. The sharp metallic bite of handcuffs closed around my wrists, cinching down on bone and nerve. A searing pain shot up my arms. Other officers had gathered now, including the one who had been filming on his phone. They were laughing and recording as I was being brutalized on the steps of my own courthouse. Through the haze of pain and disbelief, my eyes found the bronze nameplate above the entrance, the one I looked at every single morning. It was engraved with the names of the presiding judges. My name was there, etched into the metal. The Honorable K. Williams. I was being assaulted 20 feet from my own courtroom, by the very system I had sworn an oath to serve. My mind, a place usually filled with legal precedent and judicial reasoning, became a maelstrom of raw, primal thoughts. This is happening. This is real. Document everything. His face, his name tag, Martinez, the other officers, Rodriguez, Thompson. They are witnesses. No, they are accomplices. The angle of the sun, the time, the scattering of my papers, evidence, everything is evidence. Even as the humiliation washed over me, a cold, hard part of my brain, the judge part, was already building a case. Martinez had no idea. He saw a black woman he could dominate, another statistic in his personal war against the world he despised. He had no idea that he wasn't just assaulting a citizen. He was putting justice itself in handcuffs. And justice has a very, very long memory. The inside of the courthouse holding cell was a world away from the mahogany-paneled dignity of my chambers. It smelled of stale sweat, fear, and industrial-grade bleach. The concrete bench was cold and hard, a stark contrast to the plush leather of my judicial chair. For an hour, I was just another number, another body processed through the system's indifferent machinery. My requests to speak to my clerk, to an attorney, to the chief judge, were met with laughter and dismissal by the booking officers. Yeah, you and everyone else in here is a judge or a senator, one of them drawled, not even looking up from his crossword puzzle. Sit down and shut up. Meanwhile, on the fourth floor, my judicial clerk, Janet Morrison, was in a state of escalating panic. At 9:01 a.m., I hadn't appeared. Janet, a woman for whom punctuality was a religion, started making calls. First to my cell, which went straight to voicemail. It was sitting in an evidence bag on a booking officer's desk. Then to my home. No answer. By 9:30, the attorneys for the Johnson case were milling impatiently in my courtroom. Janet, her face a mask of professional calm belying her inner turmoil, approached Bailiff Henderson. "Have you seen Judge Williams?" Henderson, a large, gentle man who had been a fixture in my courtroom for a decade, shook his head. "Not this morning, Janet. It's not like her." Just then, Officer Thompson, one of Martinez's laughing accomplices, walked past. Janet stopped him. "Officer, my judge, Judge Williams, hasn't arrived this morning. We're getting worried. Have you seen anything unusual?" Thompson smirked. "Unusual? Nah. Just some crackhead outside earlier claiming she was a judge. Caused a real scene. Martinez had to take her down. Funny stuff." He chuckled and walked on, leaving Janet staring after him, a cold dread beginning to form in the pit of her stomach. The description, a black woman, claiming to be a judge, was too specific to be a coincidence. But the idea was too monstrous to contemplate. Downstairs, I was being led into a small auxiliary courtroom for a preliminary hearing. It wasn't my courtroom. It was a sterile, impersonal space used for arraignments and minor motions. A visiting judge was presiding, a pale, thin man in his 60s named Judge Harrison. I knew of him by reputation, a hardliner, a former prosecutor who was notoriously deferential to law enforcement. I was placed at the defendant's table, my hands still cuffed behind my back. The purple bruise on my cheek was beginning to throb in earnest. And then Officer Martinez took the stand. He had straightened his uniform, cleared his throat, and transformed himself from a street brawler into a paragon of civic duty. The system always believed cops over criminals, especially when the criminals looked like me. "Your Honor," Martinez began, his voice a practiced, steady baritone. "I was conducting routine security protocols when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security." He gestured toward me, his expression one of grave concern. The defendant was acting erratically, refusing to provide identification, and became increasingly agitated when asked to comply with standard security procedures. Judge Harrison nodded, his pen scratching on a legal pad. "And what exactly did you observe, Officer Martinez?" "Well, sir, she was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings, carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents." Martinez's eyes gleamed as he warmed to his fabrication. "When I approached to investigate, she became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making threats against me and my fellow officers." From the gallery, Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged knowing glances. They had heard this script dozens of times before, just with different faces at the defendant's table. "She kept screaming about being someone important," Martinez continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. I've seen this playbook before, Your Honor. It's a calculated manipulation of the system." Judge Harrison leaned forward, clearly engaged. "Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest?" "Absolutely. The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety." Martinez's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he spoke, the only crack in his polished performance. Her injuries, if any, resulted from her own violent resistance to lawful commands. He pulled out his phone, swiping to a video that conveniently started mid-confrontation after the initial slap, showing only my reaction and the subsequent struggle. "I have partial footage here, Your Honor, though unfortunately my body cam malfunctioned this morning. A routine technical glitch." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. "How convenient," I murmured, speaking for the first time. "I'm sorry?" Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, annoyed by the interruption. "Nothing, Your Honor," I replied, my voice calm, though my eyes blazed with a controlled fury. I was cataloging every lie, cross-referencing it with the legal statutes he was violating: perjury, filing a false report, obstruction of justice. He wasn't just building a case against me, he was building one against himself. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious woman named Sandra Walsh, whom I vaguely recognized, stood up. "Officer Rodriguez, can you corroborate Officer Martinez's testimony?" Rodriguez stood, his uniform pressed to perfection. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols. Officer Martinez handled the situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint." This was it. The system in action. A closed loop of lies, protected by the color of a uniform and the benefit of the doubt. They thought this was just another Tuesday, another easy conviction. They had no idea that they were testifying in a courtroom that would soon become their own personal judgment day, with me, their accuser, as the final arbiter. The game had just begun, and I knew the rules far, far better than they did. My turn to speak came after the prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, confidently rested her case. "The defendant may now present her statement," Judge Harrison announced, his tone one of bored formality. This was, in his mind, the last step before sentencing. I rose slowly from the defendant's chair. The soft clinking of the handcuffs was the only sound in the hushed courtroom. Despite the throbbing bruise on my cheek and the disarray of my clothes, I squared my shoulders and drew on 15 years of judicial presence. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. I did not look like the erratic, violent criminal they had just heard described. "Thank you, Your Honor." My voice was clear, controlled, and carried an authority that seemed to fill the room, surprising even me. It was the voice I used to command my own courtroom, and it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." Judge Harrison blinked. Something in my tone was unexpected, something that didn't fit the narrative he'd been so readily consuming. "First," I began, my eyes sweeping across the room, methodically making contact with Martinez, Rodriguez, Thompson, and the prosecutor Walsh. "I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Martinez's testimony. According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. I turned slightly, addressing Judge Harrison directly. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present. Therefore, the charge of trespassing is legally baseless. The court stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. Prosecutor Walsh's brow furrowed. This was not the rambling, emotional outburst of a typical defendant. Furthermore, I continued, Officer Martinez testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in some kind of fraud. I'd like to examine that claim. I gestured with my cuffed hands toward the evidence table where my scattered papers had been collected. Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include the case files for Johnson v. City of Brookhaven, which is on my docket for this morning, along with several judicial memoranda and administrative correspondence related to my duties, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity. Professional capacity? Judge Harrison interrupted, a flicker of irritation mixed with curiosity in his eyes. And what exactly is your profession, Miss? I paused, letting a small, calculated smile touch the corners of my mouth. Williams. And I believe we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor. A chill seemed to run through Martinez. His polished composure was beginning to crack at the edges. If I may continue, I said, my voice taking on the cadence of someone who had commanded courtrooms for a living. Officer Martinez also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. On that matter, I would like to invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. However, I added, letting the implication of that sink in, I will note for the record that any statements I may have made were in direct response to being physically assaulted by Officer Martinez, without provocation, without warning, and without any legal justification whatsoever. In the back row, the young law clerk who had been frowning throughout Martinez's testimony sat up straighter. I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was recognizing the language, the procedure. Now, regarding the officer's claim that his body cam malfunctioned, I continued, and now there was steel in my voice, and his convenient presentation of a partial video. Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 1006, the best evidence rule, and the legal concept of spoliation of evidence. I have reason to believe that comprehensive and exculpatory video and audio evidence of this morning's entire incident exists and must be made available to this court. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest now fully piqued. What kind of evidence are you referring to? Your Honor, this courthouse is under federal jurisdiction and as such is equipped with extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the entire main approach. These cameras are maintained by the U.S. Marshals Service. Additionally, the county maintains an automatic encrypted cloud backup system for all officer body cam footage, a system that uploads data in real time and cannot be erased by the officer. It exists specifically to prevent the kind of malfunction Officer Martinez has described. The color drained from Martinez's face. He had forgotten. In his rush to control the narrative, in his arrogant belief that no one would ever question his word, he had forgotten about the silent, impartial witnesses that watched over the entire federal complex. I would like to formally request, I said, pressing my advantage, that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between the hours of 8:45 a.m. and 9:15 a.m. This includes, but is not limited to, all courthouse security footage from cameras 1 through 7, the body cam backup files for officers Martinez, Rodriguez, and Thompson, and any mobile phone recordings that may have been made by officers present at the scene. Prosecutor Walsh shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. I turned to face her, and the look in my eyes made her take an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, I said, addressing the judge but keeping my gaze locked on Walsh. Under the Sixth Amendment, pro se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence and confront their accusers. Furthermore, under Brady v. Maryland, the prosecution has a constitutional obligation to disclose and preserve all potentially exculpatory evidence. I am merely reminding Ms. Walsh of her sworn duty. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. This was not how these cases were supposed to go. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, looking at me with a new, unsettling level of respect. Miss Williams, You seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training? I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor, I replied, my tone carefully neutral. I walked, as much as the handcuffs would allow, to the evidence table and gestured toward my scattered belongings. Your Honor, I would also like to address Officer Martinez's characterization of my presence here as suspicious. Among those papers, you will find my daily court calendar, which shows I was scheduled to preside over— Excuse me, I corrected myself, to appear in this very building for legitimate business starting at 9 a.m. sharp. Bailiff Henderson, standing by the door, suddenly went very still. I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by a wave of dawning horror. He knew me. He saw me every day. But out of uniform, bruised and in handcuffs, he hadn't made the connection. Until now. Your Honor, I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. I have in my possession, despite Officer Martinez's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning. I reached carefully into my jacket pocket, moving slowly. My judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office, my building access card, programmed with my judicial chamber's entry code, and— I paused, pulling out the leather credential wallet. My official identification. Bailiff Henderson took a step forward, his face ashen. Judge, he whispered, the name dying on his lips. I held up the wallet. Even from across the room, the gold judicial seal of the United States Federal Court was clearly, unmistakably visible. Perhaps, I suggested, my voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who was used to giving orders in courtrooms, not taking them. We should recess so that proper identifications can be verified. Judge Harrison stared at the credential wallet, then at my face, then at the bailiff, who was now nodding grimly, his expression a mixture of terror and apology. Court, Harrison said, his voice a hoarse croak, will recess for 15 minutes. The gavel fell with a sound like a thunderclap. As it did, Martinez's world, a world built on bullying and lies, began to crumble around him. The 15-minute recess felt like an eternity of frantic, whispered chaos for everyone except me. In a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, I sat calmly while Bailiff Henderson, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit the key in the lock, finally removed my handcuffs. Judge Williams, he whispered, his voice thick with a horror so profound it was almost comical. Jesus Christ, Judge Williams, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you, in your regular clothes. When they brought you in like that, It's all right, Henderson, I said, my voice soft but firm. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. You weren't a part of this, but I need you to do something for me now, and I need you to do it quickly and quietly. Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all. I need you to go to my chambers. On my coat rack, you will find my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim. Bring them to me. And Henderson, I looked him directly in the eye. Bring my gavel, too, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony. He nodded vigorously and hurried out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I closed my eyes and took a deep, centering breath, the way I had trained myself to do, before delivering a complex verdict. This morning, I had been Judge Kesha Williams, a respected jurist, a protector of constitutional rights. In the span of 15 minutes, I had been transformed into a filthy animal, a defendant in handcuffs. But now it was time to reclaim what was mine. My phone, which had been confiscated and unceremoniously dumped in an evidence bag, was returned to me by a trembling court clerk. It buzzed to life with a flood of missed calls and frantic text messages from Janet, my clerk. Janet, Judge Williams, where are you? The Johnson hearing is in 30 minutes. Janet, Your Honor, the attorneys are here asking about delays. Janet, Judge, please call me back. There are rumors something happened outside. I typed back quickly. Tell the Johnson attorneys we'll reschedule. Something more important has come up. Clear my entire afternoon calendar. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Chief Judge Margaret Carter, the administrative head of the entire judicial district and a friend for 20 years. Margaret, it's Kesha. Kesha, thank God. We heard there was some kind of incident. Are you all right? I've been better, I said, my voice tight. Margaret, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking questions right now. Of course. Whatever you need. Contact the U.S. Marshals for this district. Tell them to immediately preserve and make 3 separate, verified copies of all surveillance footage from the front of the courthouse this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m. All cameras, all angles. And Margaret, make sure those copies are stored in different secure locations. There was a pause. Kesha. What exactly happened this morning? A police officer named Martinez just spent an hour testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous criminal who was trespassing on courthouse property. My voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Margaret had never heard before. The dangerous criminal was me, Margaret, on my way to work. He didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me, called me a filthy animal, and told me I belonged in a cage. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a full 30 seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, furious hiss. Jesus Christ, Kesha. What do you need? Should I call the FBI, the Attorney General's office? Not yet, I said. Right now, I just need those recordings secured, and I need you to make some phone calls. I want every single case Officer Frank Martinez has testified in over the past 5 years pulled and flagged for immediate review. Every single one. Consider it done, Margaret said. But Kesha, you can't handle this yourself. It's a massive conflict of interest. Oh, I'm not going to handle it, Margaret, I said as Henderson returned, carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom wearing my judicial robes. Officer Martinez is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning. And more importantly, he's going to learn who has the power to ensure he faces the consequences of his actions. He's about to be the star of a masterclass in accountability. I hung up the phone. Henderson reverently unzipped the garment bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been my armor for 15 years. As I slipped them on, I felt the transformation begin. The weight of the fabric on my shoulders was a familiar comfort, a mantle of authority. Each fold, each line was a reminder of the power I wielded, the oaths I had taken, the justice I was sworn to uphold. I opened the wooden box and lifted out my ceremonial gavel. Its weight was a solid, comforting presence in my hand. Engraved on its handle were the words my father had given me on the day of my investiture. Justice is blind, but she sees all. Henderson, I said, adjusting my robes. When we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me properly. Yes, Your Honor. How would you like to be announced? I straightened to my full height, every inch the federal judge I was. I looked at myself in the small mirror on the wall. The bruise on my cheek was a stark, ugly purple against my brown skin. But it was no longer a mark of victimization. It was evidence. It was Exhibit A in the case of the People versus Frank Martinez. Announce me, I said, my voice ringing with the authority of the United States government, as the Honorable Judge Kesha Williams presiding. All rise. Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with an authority that made every person snap to attention. The air crackled with confused, nervous energy. What happened next would be seared into their memories for the rest of their lives. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Kesha Williams presiding. The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Officer Martinez, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, whispering with Walsh, went rigid. Judge Harrison, who had retaken his seat on the bench, turned a color I could only describe as corpse gray. Prosecutor Walsh's mouth fell open in a perfect, silent O of disbelief. I entered not from the public door, but from the private entrance that led directly from the judge's chambers to the bench. I wore my full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the overhead lights. I moved with the measured, deliberate pace of someone who owned the very ground she walked on. In my right hand, I carried my ceremonial gavel. The silence was absolute, profound. Not a single person dared to breathe. I took my place behind the bench, my bench, and sat down slowly. My eyes swept the courtroom, lingering for a moment on each shocked face, each dropped jaw. I took in the scene, the 3 officers, now looking like cornered animals, the prosecutor utterly lost, the visiting judge, who looked like he wished the floor would swallow him whole. Finally, my gaze settled on Officer Martinez. "Officer Martinez," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the full, amplified weight of judicial authority. "You may remain standing." He looked like he was about to vomit. His face had cycled from red to white to a sickly green in the span of 30 seconds. Your Honor," Judge Harrison stammered, scrambling to rise from the chair that was rightfully mine. We didn't. I mean to say." "Judge Harrison," I interrupted, my tone crisp but not unkind. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket. I will handle this matter from here." Harrison practically fled the bench, his robes billowing behind him as if he were being chased by demons. The seat of power was now correctly occupied. I turned my attention back to Martinez, who was visibly shaking. "Officer Martinez, approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" He couldn't form words. "Let me refresh your memory," I continued, my voice as cold and sharp as broken glass. "You stated, and I quote from the stenographer's record, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' Do you remember saying that?" Martinez managed a weak, jerky nod. "You also stated," I went on, "that I was, quote, 'another ghetto rat trying to sneak in.' Is that an accurate recollection of your words?" The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the HVAC system sounded like a roaring jet engine. "And perhaps most memorably," my voice grew colder still, "you stated that people like me need to learn that, quote, 'actions have consequences.' Do you recall dispensing that particular piece of wisdom, officer?" His legs were shaking so violently he had to grip the prosecutor IS table to keep from collapsing. I reached under the bench and pulled out a tablet computer, which Henderson had placed there for me. I had already queued up the first exhibit. "Officer Martinez, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just been brought to the court's attention." I turned the tablet screen toward the courtroom. On it was crystal clear, high-definition security camera footage from the courthouse steps, showing the entire incident from multiple, damning angles. "This," I announced, "is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which has an unobstructed view of the main entrance. Let's watch together, shall we?" I pressed play. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as the truth unfolded on the screen. There I was, walking calmly toward the entrance. There was Martinez blocking my path. His voice, clear as day from the ambient microphones, filled the courtroom. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in." Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. The video continued, showing Martinez's unprovoked, brutal assault in vivid, undeniable detail. The vicious slap that snapped my head sideways, the brutal slam against the wall, the contemptuous sneer on his face. But the most damning moment was his own voice, captured with perfect clarity. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." His own words, spoken with such venom, echoed through the very room where justice was supposed to be dispensed. Several spectators stood up and walked out in disgust. I paused the video. "Officer Martinez," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You testified under oath that I was verbally aggressive, that I used profanity, that I made threats. Do you see any evidence of that in this footage?" He remained silent, his career disintegrating before his eyes. "Now," I continued, swiping to a new video file, "let's examine your claim that your body cam malfunctioned. This, officer, is the automatic cloud backup footage from your own body cam, a system you were trained on but apparently forgot existed." The new video began from his own point of view, and his voice, his real thoughts before the confrontation, filled the courtroom. "Look at this uppity bitch thinking she can just walk into my courthouse. These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another lesson." The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, was frantically gathering her papers, trying to physically distance herself from the catastrophe. But I wasn't finished with her, or with Martinez's accomplices. "Officer Rodriguez, Officer Thompson," I called out, my voice ringing with authority. "You both testified under oath that Officer Martinez handled this situation with remarkable professionalism. After viewing this evidence, would either of you like to revise your statements under penalty of perjury?" Both men looked as if they were about to faint. They were already edging toward the exit, but the doors were now blocked by two stone-faced U.S. Marshals whom Henderson had quietly summoned. There was no escape. "And here," I said, advancing the video to the moment of the assault, seen from his own perspective. "We can see the exact moment when Officer Martinez committed felony assault. Assault, I might add, against a federal judge." I let those words hang in the air for a moment. Federal judge. Martinez's knees finally buckled. He collapsed into the chair at the defendant's table. But I wasn't done. The lesson had to be complete. I pulled up a new file. This is audio from Officer Thompson's body cam, which was apparently functioning perfectly this morning. Thompson's voice, speaking to Rodriguez while Martinez was assaulting me, filled the room. "Dude's really going off on this one. Think she's actually somebody important like she keeps saying?" Rodriguez's voice responded, full of laughter. "Nah, man, look at her. Martinez knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system." The laughter of the two officers echoed in the silent courtroom as they watched their colleague brutalize a federal judge. "Officer Martinez," I said, setting down the tablet, "you questioned my identity. You dismissed my presence. You assumed my station in life based on the color of my skin." I gestured to the Great Seal of the United States on the wall behind my bench, then to my nameplate, then to the official judicial portrait of me that hung in the courthouse lobby. "I have been the presiding judge of this district for 15 years, Officer Martinez. Every case you have ever testified in, every warrant you have ever requested, every search you have ever conducted in this jurisdiction has ultimately been under my authority." He finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "You didn't know?" I repeated the words slowly, letting the pathetic inadequacy of them fill the room. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman and you made assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless, and you decided to abuse your power." I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his. "But Officer Martinez, there's something else you didn't know." The courtroom held its breath. For the past 6 months, my office has been conducting a joint investigation with the FBI's Civil Rights Division and the Department of Justice into patterns of misconduct, perjury, and racial bias within your department. His face went completely white. He looked like a dead man walking. "This morning's incident wasn't random, Officer Martinez. You have been a person of interest in that investigation for months. And today," I paused, picking up my gavel, "you just provided us with the most perfect, unambiguous, and irrefutable evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could ever hope for. You were right about one thing." I held the gavel aloft. "Actions have consequences." I brought the gavel down with a crack like thunder. "This court will now recess while I consider the appropriate criminal charges to be filed against Officers Martinez, Rodriguez, and Thompson." I stood and exited to my chambers, leaving behind the smoking ruins of 3 careers and a system that had, for one brief, shining moment, been forced to confront the truth. When court resumed 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The gallery was packed. Word had spread through the courthouse like wildfire, and lawyers, clerks, and staff from other courtrooms had quietly filed in, drawn by the whispers of the most spectacular courtroom reversal in the building's history. Martinez, Rodriguez, and Thompson were no longer standing as witnesses. They were seated at the defendant's table, each flanked by a hastily summoned public defender who looked utterly overwhelmed. Martinez sat slumped in his chair, his uniform wrinkled, his face ashen. I returned to the bench with the same measured dignity, but now every eye in the room saw me differently. This wasn't just any judge. This was the woman who had been brutalized by the men now trembling before her. "Officer Martinez," I began, opening a thick file that had been placed on my bench. It was his complete personnel record, including the 47 complaints that Chief Judge Carter's office had already compiled. "Before we proceed with the serious criminal charges you now face, I believe this court, and everyone present, deserves to understand the pattern of behavior that led us to this moment." I stood, moving around the bench to address the packed courtroom directly. This was no longer just a hearing. It was a public lesson in systemic failure. My name is Judge Kesha Williams. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was editor of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to this bench, I served for 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Martinez's public defender was frantically scribbling notes, likely calculating the decades of prison time his client was now facing. During my tenure as a prosecutor, I continued, my voice resonating with passion, I specialized in cases involving police misconduct. I successfully prosecuted 47 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority, who lied under oath, who violated the constitutional rights of the citizens they were sworn to protect. I paused, letting that number sink in. Then I walked closer to where Martinez sat cowering. But in all my years of service, Officer Martinez, I have never encountered such a perfect, distilled example of everything that is wrong with a system that protects men like you. I returned to my position behind the bench and opened his file. This file contains detailed records of every case you've testified in over the past 5 years. 43 cases, Officer Martinez. 43 times you have stood in this very courthouse and sworn to tell the truth. I flipped through several pages. 28 of those cases involved defendants who were people of color. And in every single one, you described the defendants using remarkably similar language to what you used with me this morning. Acting erratically, refusing to comply, becoming aggressive, threatening officer safety. The same words, the same narrative, the same lies, over and over again. I closed the file with a sharp snap. But here's what you didn't know, Officer Martinez. As I mentioned, my office has been working with the FBI. Your name, officer, appears on a federal watch list for officers with a high number of civilian complaints and a statistically significant pattern of racially biased arrests. You have been under surveillance. Your communications have been monitored. Your arrest patterns have been analyzed. I leaned forward. And this morning, Officer Martinez, you walked right into the middle of our investigation and handed us a signed confession on a silver platter. I lifted my gavel. You assaulted a federal judge while she was performing her official duties. You did so based explicitly on racial animus, as evidenced by your own recorded statements. You then committed perjury when you lied under oath about the circumstances of that assault. You conspired with your fellow officers to obstruct a federal investigation. Officer Martinez, you asked me this morning if I knew my place. My voice filled the courtroom with quiet, unshakable authority. My place is on this bench in this courtroom ensuring that justice is served. My place is holding people like you accountable when you abuse the power we have entrusted to you. The gavel came down once, a sharp crack of finality. My place, Officer Martinez, is making sure that what you did to me this morning is the last act of racial violence you will ever commit as a police officer. I then proceeded with the formal charges. In the matter of the United States versus Frank Martinez, this court finds probable cause to charge you with the following federal crimes: assault on a federal officer, perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. I turned to his accomplices. In the matter of the United States versus David Rodriguez and Richard Thompson, this court finds probable cause to charge you with perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. You will all be remanded into the custody of the U.S. Marshals without bail, pending your formal indictment. The marshals moved in, cuffing the 3 officers. The sound of the metal ratcheting shut was the only sound in the room. Martinez finally broke down completely, his body shaking with sobs as he was led away. But I wasn't finished. I addressed the shaken prosecutor, Sandra Walsh. Ms. Walsh, your conduct this morning, your failure to question the obvious inconsistencies in the officer's testimony, and your eagerness to prosecute a victim without a shred of credible evidence represents a catastrophic failure of your duty as an officer of the court. I am referring your conduct to the State Bar for immediate investigation and disciplinary action. She wilted, her career in tatters. Finally, I looked out over the packed gallery, over the faces of the clerks, the lawyers, the citizens who had witnessed this extraordinary moment. Let this be a message, I said, my voice ringing with the full force of the law. To every police officer, every prosecutor, every official who thinks they can abuse their power without consequences. Justice may be blind, but she sees everything. And eventually, My eyes found the courthouse doors through which Martinez had just been led. She comes for everyone. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that historic morning were still transforming the city's justice system. Officer Martinez was convicted on all federal charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His fellow inmates, having learned of his crimes through the extensive news coverage, made his life a living hell. The man who once terrorized a community now lived in constant fear, finally understanding what it felt like to be powerless. Rodriguez and Thompson, in exchange for their testimony against Martinez and others in the department, received lesser sentences of 5 years each. But their downfall was just the beginning. The federal investigation I had initiated, now supercharged by the undeniable evidence from my own assault, uncovered a web of corruption and systemic racism that reached deep into the police department's command structure. 12 other officers were indicted. The police chief was forced to resign. The entire department was placed under a federal consent decree, a sweeping set of reforms that I was appointed to oversee personally. The 432 cases Martinez had tainted over the years were reopened. To date, 37 wrongfully convicted defendants had been released from prison. Their lives returned to them after years, sometimes decades, of unjust incarceration. One of them was Jamal, the young man I had been mentoring. Years earlier, Martinez had arrested him on trumped-up charges, a felony conviction that had haunted his youth and limited his opportunities. With his record expunged, that scholarship he had applied for came through. He started his first semester at the state university last month, majoring in pre-law. He calls me every Sunday night. My courthouse, by a unanimous act of Congress, was renamed. It is now the Honorable Kesha Williams Federal Courthouse. Near the entrance, on the very spot where Martinez assaulted me, a bronze plaque is now installed. It doesn't mention the incident. It simply reads, "Justice is blind, but she sees all." I still walk to work every morning. I still pause to look up at the building. The name on the stone is now my own, a constant, heavy reminder of the promise I made to myself 15 years ago. The work is never done. The garden of justice requires constant, vigilant tending. But on mornings like this, when the sun hits the bronze just right, I can see the crocuses pushing through the hard winter soil, and I know that hope, however stubborn, can and will bloom.